The cabin went pitch black at 35,000 feet. It wasn't a flicker. It was a void, like the universe just threw a switch on our airplane. The first scream came out of the total darkness, and then the sound, a high-pitched howl of wind that I shouldn't have been able to hear inside the plane. We fell for 2 minutes in absolute black. I didn't see the impact. I didn't see the metal twist. The next thing I felt was ice. Water so cold it burned, flooding my legs, my chest, as the plane tore itself in two. I was alive, but I was trapped underwater in the dark, sinking in a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere. And that's when I realized the very thing that saved me was also the reason I was about to die. Before I tell you how I got out of that ice water tomb, tell me quick in the comments what city you're listening to this story from. I want to see how far this has reached. For me, it was just another Tuesday. Alaska Flight 77, a red-eye out of Anchorage. It was past 1 a.m. and I was exhausted. My name is Alex Reed. I'm a geothermal engineer. My job is to fly to incredibly remote, cold places, analyze the ground, and fly home. I've been on planes so small I felt like I could reach out and touch the wings. I've landed on gravel strips and ice runways. Flying, for me, isn't a luxury. It's a bus ride. I was in seat 28A window, in the tail section. I always take the window. I like watching the physics of it, the flaps, the wing flex. It reminds me that this all works on rules, not magic. The plane was a 737, mostly full. The takeoff was smooth. Once we hit cruising altitude, the cabin settled into that specific quiet hum of a late-night flight. Most passengers were asleep instantly. Not me. I had my laptop open. I had a geotechnical report to finish before we landed in Chicago. The blue light of the screen cast a small glow in my space. I remember looking out the window. There was nothing to see, just absolute darkness over the Yukon. No city lights, no stars, just black. I remember thinking how incredibly isolated we were. 35,000 feet up, hundreds of miles from the nearest town. A tiny pressurized metal can hurtling at 500 miles per hour through the void. I rubbed my eyes. The report could wait. I closed the laptop and my world went back to the dim cabin light, broken only by the no smoking signs and the faint emergency lighting on the floor. I leaned back. I put in my earbuds, but I didn't play any music. I just wanted to dull the engine drone, and I drifted off. I don't know how long I was asleep, maybe an hour. I woke up to a strange feeling. It wasn't turbulence. It was the sound. I pulled my earbuds out. It was a high-pitched whine, an electrical sound like a transformer about to blow. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The reading lights above my head flickered. Once, twice, and then they died. The entire plane, every light. The soft cabin illumination, the no smoking signs, the in-seat entertainment screens, even the emergency lights on the floor, everything black. It was the deepest, most absolute darkness I have ever experienced. A black so thick it felt like pressure on my eyes. And in that darkness, the electrical whine stopped. It was replaced by a terrifying silence, because the engines had gone quiet too. We were no longer being pushed. We were just gliding. A woman in the row ahead of me gasped, a short, choked sound. What was that? Someone's phone flashlight clicked on, a single panicked beam of light cutting the darkness. It illuminated confused, pale faces. Then, the floor dropped out from under us. It wasn't a gentle dip. It was a lurch. That negative G feeling of your stomach rising into your throat. My body lifted off the seat, held down only by the lap belt. My laptop, which I'd put in the seat pocket in front of me, flew out and hit the ceiling. I could hear plates and glass shattering in the galley, and then the screaming started. It was the screaming of people who were completely blind. The plane wasn't falling straight. It began to bank hard to the left. I was on the left side. I pressed my face to the window, desperate for a reference. The moon, stars, anything. There was nothing, just the sound, the wind. A deafening, high-pitched shriek that was getting louder and louder. It was the sound of air tearing at the skin of the aircraft. It meant we were going fast. Way too fast. There was no announcement from the pilot. No oxygen masks dropped. Just darkness and the sound of our own fall. People were praying. Some were cursing. I just gripped my armrests, bracing my back against the seat. My engineer's mind was trying to calculate. What failed? Total electrical? Double engine failure? How high were we? How much time did we have? But the physics had abandoned me. There was only terror. The cabin started to smell like burning electrical wires. The plane began to shake so violently my teeth chattered. The sound of the wind was so loud now it drowned out the screams. It was like being strapped to the wing of a jet. I knew what was coming. You don't fall like this and not know. I clenched my jaw. I waited for the impact. I waited, and I waited. Every second was an eternity in that blackness. And then, the hit. It wasn't a single hit. It was a symphony of destruction. The first sound was a low-frequency thud that felt like a giant hammer hitting the belly of the plane. It was followed, instantly, by the most agonizing sound I have ever heard. The sound of metal screaming. It was a high-pitched, tearing shriek as the fuselage was ripped open. I was thrown forward with such force that the seatbelt felt like it was cutting me in half. My head snapped forward and slammed into the seat in front of me, and the world exploded in a brief white flash of light behind my closed eyes. For a split second I was grateful for the light, even if it was just my own brain short-circuiting. Then came the chaos. The plane wasn't just stopping, it was coming apart. In the total darkness, I could feel, more than hear, the structure failing. There was a violent sideways lurch that threw me against the cabin wall. My shoulder hit the window so hard I heard a crack, and I wasn't sure if it was the window or my collarbone. The plane was sliding. After the initial impact, there was this horrifying, grinding momentum. I could feel the incredible friction as this multi-ton metal tube scraped across something. It was loud, a deafening roar of metal on rock or metal on ice. I could feel the floor vibrating so intensely it blurred my vision, not that I could see anything. Then, the second impact. It wasn't a hit from below. It was a stop. A sudden catastrophic deceleration that felt like we had hit a mountain. This must have been when the fuselage broke. I heard a sound like a thunderclap right next to my ear, and my entire section of the plane felt like it twisted. I could hear the structure of the plane groaning, popping and snapping like firewood. And then, silence. A silence so profound it was almost as violent as the crash itself. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of quiet. The wind was gone. The screaming of the metal was gone. Even the human screams had stopped. I was alive. My first thought was that simple. I am alive. I was breathing in short, painful gasps. The air was thick. It smelled of burnt plastic, of ozone, and something else. A sharp, chemical smell. Jet fuel. And it was cold. A deep, penetrating cold was already seeping in. "Hello?" I whispered. My voice was hoarse. I tried to move my feet. They were stuck. I tried to move my arms. My left arm, the one that hit the wall, sent a shooting pain up to my neck. "Hello!" I yelled, louder this time. I heard a low moan from somewhere in the darkness ahead of me. "Help me!" A woman's voice. So I wasn't alone. I tried to orient myself. I was still upright in my seat. The darkness was absolute. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely control them. I couldn't find it. Is everyone okay?" A man's voice shouted from the back. And that's when I felt it. The title of this story. The next thing I felt was ice. It wasn't ice. It was water. It was a sensation that started at my feet. A wetness, followed by a cold so intense it was burning. It was the kind of cold that steals your breath. The kind I knew from my work in the Arctic. The floor of the plane was gone. The water wasn't seeping in. It was rushing in. "Water!" I screamed. "There's water!" The reaction was immediate. The moans turned into panicked shrieks. The man who had shouted before now just yelled a string of curses. The water was at my ankles, then my shins. It was rising incredibly fast. This was the moment. The plane hadn't just crashed on the ice. It had broken the ice. We were in the lake, sinking. I had to get out of my seat. I fumbled in the blackness for the seatbelt buckle. My fingers were already becoming numb from the cold air, and the adrenaline made them feel thick and useless. The water was at my knees. It was so cold that my legs began to cramp instantly, a deep, agonizing ache. Where was the buckle? I couldn't find it. I followed the strap down from my shoulder, across my chest, down to my lap. My hand went underwater. The water was now at my waist. I finally found the metal latch. I pressed the release. Click. The belt sprang open, but I didn't float up. I was pinned. When the plane had twisted, the seat in front of me had collapsed backward, crushing my legs against my own seat. The metal bar from its base was jammed across my shins. I was trapped. In the dark, with freezing water rising past my stomach, I was trapped. I pulled at my legs. The pain was excruciating, but the cold was worse. I couldn't feel my feet anymore. "Help!" I yelled. "I'm stuck! My legs are stuck!" The woman who had been moaning was now sobbing, a desperate choking sound. "It's on me. I can't breathe." The water was at my chest. I had to tilt my head back to keep my mouth in the shrinking pocket of air. The smell of jet fuel was overwhelming, floating on the surface of the water. This is it. This is how I die. Not from the impact, but from drowning in the dark, pinned to my chair, in a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere. My mind was racing. My engineering brain was offline. This was pure animal panic. I took one last huge gulp of the toxic air, and I went underwater. I had to see with my hands. I plunged my arms into the freezing water, the shock of it against my face making me want to exhale. But I held on. I felt down my legs. I found the metal bar. It was bent, wedged tight. I couldn't pull it. I had to push. I put my back against my seat, found the wreckage of the seat in front of me with my hands, and pushed with all the strength I had left in my upper body. My lungs were on fire. The darkness was total, both outside and inside my head. I pushed. The metal groaned. It didn't move. I was out of time. I needed air. I knew if I surfaced, the air pocket might be gone. This was my only chance. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, I didn't just push. I twisted. I turned my whole body sideways, bending my trapped legs at an angle they weren't meant to bend. I felt a sickening wet pop in my left knee, and I was free. I shot. Upwards, my lungs burning, desperate for that last pocket of air. My head broke the surface and I gasped, sucking in the foul, fuel-laced air. The water was at my chin, and the ceiling of the cabin was only inches from my face. The air pocket was almost gone. I had maybe a minute before the entire section was submerged. The woman I'd heard earlier was silent, but the man in the back, I could hear him. He was no longer yelling, just making a low, gurgling sound. He was drowning, right there in the dark with me. My own leg was screaming in agony. The pop I'd felt was my knee. It felt loose, floating, and a new hot pain was cutting through the numbness. I knew I had to move, right now, or I would die with them. For one terrible second, I thought about trying to find the woman, or the man. But how? I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. I was underwater, in a graveyard, and I was the only one who had found the key to my own cell. To try and find them would be suicide. That realization, that I had to leave them, was a different kind of impact. I had to get out. But where was out? The doors were underwater. The windows were too small and probably sealed by the pressure. I was trapped in a sinking metal tube. I treaded water, the icy water making my muscles feel like cement. My heavy winter coat was waterlogged, pulling me down. I thought back to the crash. I felt the plane twist. I heard the metal tear. If it tore, there had to be a hole. The shriek of the wind I heard during the fall. It was gone, which meant the break was likely underwater. I had to swim for it. But swim where? I floated in the blackness, my heart hammering so loud I could feel it in my jaw. I tried to think like an engineer. The tail section had snapped off. It had slid. Which way was it open? I turned my head, and that's when I felt it. A draft. On the right side of my face, the tiny sliver of air was moving. Air was being pushed out. If air was getting out, water was getting in. I had to go against the flow, toward the hole. I took a deep breath, held it, and dove back down. The swim was a nightmare. It was pure sensory deprivation. I was blind, swimming through an obstacle course of floating luggage, seat cushions, and sharp, jagged pieces of the cabin's interior. My waterlogged clothes snagged on everything. My injured leg was a dead weight, a useless anchor that I had to drag behind me. I kept my arms out, pulling myself along by grabbing the ceiling, feeling my way through the dark water. The jet fuel was so thick now that it burned my eyes, even closed. My lungs ached. I was moving so slowly. Just when I was convinced I was swimming in circles, just when my lungs were about to burst and force me to inhale the freezing water, I saw it. It wasn't light. It was a less black shape, a faint, pale, bluish-gray patch in the absolute darkness. It was the hole. It was the break in the fuselage. It was the moonlight on the ice, seen from under the water. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. I kicked with my one good leg, a desperate, frantic push. My head broke the surface of the open lake. The sound I made was not human. It was a deep, guttural gasp for air, a sob and a scream all at once. The air was so cold it felt like swallowing glass. The temperature outside the plane was 30 below zero, far colder than the water, which was hovering right at freezing. The wind hit my wet face and clothes, like a physical blow. I was out of the plane, but I was in the middle of a vast, frozen lake. My hands grabbed the edge of the ice. It was sharp, broken. I tried to pull myself up, but my arms were weak, my clothes impossibly heavy. My injured leg was useless. I was a dead weight. I kicked with my good leg, trying to get a purchase, but I just slipped back into the water. Panic seized me again. I was going to die right here, 2 feet from safety, dying of exposure while clinging to the edge. No, I growled to myself, to the wind. No. I let myself sink for a second, then kicked hard with my right leg, using the buoyancy to propel my torso up. I hooked my right arm over the edge of the ice, and then my left. I was like an animal, clawing my way out. I lay there, half on the ice, half in the water, for a full minute, gasping. Then, with a final, agonizing surge, I rolled my body onto the solid surface. I made it. I was out. I lay on my back, on the ice, shivering. So violently my teeth felt like they would shatter. The wind was howling, a high-pitched, lonely sound. After the chaos of the crash, the silence of this place was terrifying. I sat up, the pain in my knee making me cry out. I looked back at the hole I had escaped from. All I could see was a dark, jagged wound in the ice, with the very tip of the 737's tail fin sticking out of the water, like a shark's fin. The rest of my section was already gone, submerged in the black. Then I looked for the rest of the plane. About 100 yards away, in the dim moonlight, I saw it. There was a massive, gaping hole in the lake. The main fuselage, the wings, everything. It had all plunged straight through. It was gone. There was just black water, steaming in the frigid air. There were no other survivors. There were no fires. There were no flashing lights. There were no voices. The silence was absolute. I was alone, soaked to the bone, badly injured, in the middle of the Canadian wilderness, in the dead of night, with the temperature dropping. The fight to escape the plane was over. The fight to survive the night had just begun. The reality of my situation crashed down on me with more force than the plane itself. I was on the ice. I was alive, but I was dying. My body was convulsing in a violent, uncontrollable shiver. It was a full-body tremor that started in my chest and radiated out, making my limbs jerk and my teeth chatter so hard I thought they would crack. This wasn't just shivering from cold. This was the first stage of severe hypothermia. My soaked winter coat and jeans were a suit of armor made of ice, actively sucking every last bit of warmth from my core. I knew from my training in the Arctic that I had minutes, not hours, before my muscles seized, my brain shut down, and I simply fell asleep. My left leg was a disaster. The pain was a dull, hot throb, and when I tried to move it, it just flopped. The knee was gone. I couldn't walk. I couldn't even stand. I was a wet, crippled man, alone on a vast, dark, frozen lake, with a 30 wind screaming in my ears. For a second, I just lay there on my back, looking up at the black sky, and I thought, this is it. I did all that. I fought the water. I escaped the dark, just to freeze to death out here. The absurdity of it, the cruel joke, made me want to laugh, but the sound that came out was a broken sob. No, I couldn't stop. Not after leaving those people in the dark. I had to survive, if only to tell someone they were there. I had to move. I had to get out of the wind. I looked around in the dim moonlight. The lake was a flat, white expanse of nothing. There was no shore in sight, no trees, no rocks. There was only one thing, the wreckage, the piece of the tail fin I had crawled out of. resting on the edge of the ice shelf like a beached broken whale. It was the tomb I had just escaped, and now it was my only hope for shelter. I began to crawl. It was the most pathetic, agonizing journey of my life. I pushed with my right leg and pulled with my arms, dragging my useless left leg behind me. The ice was sharp and uneven, cutting into my hands, which were now so numb I could barely feel them. They were just frozen claws. Every movement sent a jolt of fire through my knee. The 20 yards from where I had collapsed to the wreckage felt like a marathon. The wind was a physical enemy, pushing me, stinging any exposed skin. I wasn't just cold, I was being frozen solid. When I finally reached the tail section, I hauled myself inside. It was a jagged cave of metal. The seats were mangled, the floor was gone, and one side was open to the lake. But the other side, the curved fuselage wall, was intact. It was a windbreak. I crawled into the deepest, darkest corner, behind a row of crushed seats, and collapsed. The wind's howl instantly quieted to a dull whistle. It was still lethally cold, but the wind was no longer stripping my heat away. Now, for the hardest part, I had to get my clothes off. This is counterintuitive. Your brain screams to huddle inside your coat, but my training knew better. Wet clothes are a death sentence. They are a cold conduction machine. I had to get them off and try to dry my skin. My fingers were useless. They were frozen, stiff, like wooden pegs. I couldn't grip the zipper on my coat. I fumbled with it, weeping in frustration, the hot tears freezing on my cheeks. I had to use my teeth. I bent my head, bit down on the metal zipper tab, and pulled. It ripped my lip, and I tasted the salt of my own blood. But the zipper went down. Peeling the coat off was torture. It was frozen stiff in places and heavy with water. It took me 5 minutes, shivering so hard I kept hitting my face on the wreckage. Then the sweater underneath. Then the jeans. This was the lowest point. I was naked, in the dark, in a 30 wind chill, my body a pale, shaking wreck, with a leg that was swelling to twice its normal size. I was sure this was the moment I would die. I had stripped away my last layer of defense. I fumbled through the pockets of my discarded icy coat, not even sure what I was looking for. My phone. It was gone. My wallet. Soaked, useless. And then my frozen fingers brushed against a small, hard plastic cylinder. My kit, my work-mandated Arctic survival kit. A waterproof tube no bigger than my thumb. I always had it. I'd almost forgotten it. With clumsy wooden hands, I twisted the cap. It was sealed tight. I used my teeth again, gripping and twisting, the plastic cutting into my gums. It opened. Inside were 3 waterproof matches, a small striking strip, and a chemical hand warmer packet. It was a spark of hope so small it was almost painful. But how to start a fire? I was in a metal can. Everything was wet. I needed tinder. I tore at the fabric of the seat cushion next to me. It was soaked with lake water and jet fuel. Useless. I looked around wildly. And then I saw it, jammed under the seat in front of me, somehow protected from the water. My laptop bag. I crawled to it, my naked skin sticking to the freezing metal floor of the plane. I unzipped it. My laptop was there, its screen shattered, and underneath it, my report, my 50-page geotechnical survey. Paper. My hands were shaking too badly to work. I fumbled a match out of the tube. I tried to strike it. The matchstick snapped. I cursed, the sound stolen by the wind. I took another. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the shiver for just 1 second. I braced my hand against the metal wall. I scraped the match. A flare. It lit. A tiny, perfect, beautiful flame. I brought it to the corner of my report. The paper was dry. It curled, blackened, and caught fire. I huddled over it, feeding it page by page. Analysis of subarctic bedrock. The title page read, before it turned to ash. I fed my life's work into the tiny fire. Thermal conductivity tests. Seismic data. The fire grew. i.e. small flickering beacon in the immense darkness. It wasn't much. It wouldn't heat the cabin. But it was light. It was heat. I held my frozen hands over it, feeling the first pins and needles of blood returning. The pain was unbelievable. A deep, burning thaw. But it was the best pain I'd ever felt. I ripped the packet of the chemical hand warmer and crushed the disc inside. It began to heat up. I shoved it under my armpit, trapping it against my core. The fire was dying. I had burned through my whole report. The last page went up, and the flame vanished, plunging me back into darkness, but a different kind of darkness. The shivering was less violent. The hand warmer was a small furnace against my skin. I had survived the first hour. I had beaten the water, and I had held off the ice. I huddled there, naked and broken, but I was alive. I told myself to just make it until dawn. The sun would come. Rescue would come. And then I heard a new sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, deep groan coming from beneath me. A sound like a tree splitting, followed by a sharp crack. The ice shelf I was resting on. It was cracking under the weight of the wreckage. The lake wasn't finished with me. That single sharp crack was more terrifying than the crash itself. The crash was an event. This was a process. The massive piece of ice I was on, the platform that held the wreckage of the tail section, was failing. I felt the entire structure beneath me lurch, a slow, sickening slide. As a new fissure opened up, the groaning of the ice was a deep, resonating bass note that I felt in my chest. The lake was a living monster, and it was slowly opening its jaws to swallow the last piece of the plane, with me inside it. My tiny, sputtering fire was long gone. My report turned to ash, and the darkness was absolute again. I was naked, my leg was shattered, and my only shelter was about to become my coffin. The paralysis of the cold was battling the adrenaline of pure panic. I couldn't stay here, but where could I go? I was on an island of ice surrounded by water. I couldn't walk, I couldn't swim, and I couldn't see. My survival, my escape from the water, it was all for nothing. I was going to die here, 10 yards from where I started, just slower. But I couldn't just sit here and wait for the ice to give way. I had to get my clothes back on. The thought was agony. My wet jeans and coat were now stiff, frozen solid like sheets of plywood. But if I went back into the water, I needed something, anything, on my skin. Putting them back on was the worst torture yet. I grabbed my jeans, and the denim was so stiff with ice I had to bend it, crackling, just to get my good leg in. Pulling them up over my injured knee made me scream, a thin, raw sound that the wind snatched away. The fabric was like sandpaper coated in ice, scraping my numb skin. Then the coat. My arms wouldn't bend the right way. My fingers were just frozen clubs. I had to force my arms into the icy sleeves, and the wetness instantly started to suck the last of my core heat away. The chemical hand warmer under my arm was a tiny, singular point of warmth in a universe of cold. I was dressed, but I was now colder than when I was naked, and I was still trapped. I crawled to the opening of the wreckage, dragging my leg. The wind hit me like a solid wall. I looked out, praying to see a shoreline, a light, anything. There was nothing, just blackness, the howl of the wind and the terrifying, periodic groan of the ice beneath me. There was no escape. There was only waiting. I retreated back into the deepest part of the wreckage, curled into a ball, and began the long wait. I had to fight sleep. I knew, with the certainty of my training, that sleep was not rest. Sleep was the end. It was the sweet part of hypothermia, the part where you stop shivering, feel warm, and just drift off. It was the final, lethal lie your body tells you. I fought it. I dug my numb fingernails into the palm of my other hand, hoping to feel pain. I couldn't. I bit my own tongue, tasting the metallic tang of blood again. I thought about the ELT, the emergency locator transmitter. It was in the tail section. It was supposed to activate on impact, to send a signal to a satellite, to tell the world we are here. But had it? The electrical system was fried. Was the battery independent? Was the antenna broken? My entire life was now staked on a piece of technology I couldn't see. A maybe. That was my only lifeline. I just had to stay alive long enough for the maybe to pay off. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time had no meaning. There was only the cold, the pain in my leg, and the fight to keep my eyes open. The shivering became a deep, racking quake that consumed my whole body. I was just a consciousness inside a failing machine. And then I noticed a change. The absolute blackness of the sky was fading. It wasn't black anymore. It was a deep, bruised indigo. Then, a flat, dead gray. Dawn. The sun was coming. I had made it through the night. The first light crept across the horizon, and for the first time, I saw where I was. It was a vision from hell. I was on a large fractured plate of ice, maybe 50 feet wide. The tail section was tilted, its broken end dipping into the water. My ice floe was separated from the main, solid shore of the lake by a channel of black, open water, a gap of perhaps 100 feet, and the shoreline itself. It was miles away. A distant, dark line of pine trees. The scale of the wilderness was crushing. I was a speck of nothing, but the light meant they could see me, if they were looking. My shivering was slowing down. I knew this was a bad sign. It meant my body was out of fuel. I was losing the energy to even try and stay warm. I was entering the final, fatal stage. I was so tired. It would be so easy to just close my eyes, just for a minute. And then I heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the ice. It was a new sound. A rhythmic, mechanical whoomp, whoomp, whoomp that was out of place in this dead world. At first I thought I was hallucinating. Hypothermia does that. You hear things, you see things. But the sound was getting louder. It was a pulse, a heartbeat. I forced my head out of the wreckage. I scanned the gray sky. Nothing. The sound was everywhere, echoing off the ice. And then I saw it. A black dot, low on the horizon, moving fast against the clouds. A helicopter. A Canadian. Military search and rescue chopper, a huge yellow machine. The ELT had worked. They were here. I felt a surge of energy so powerful it almost stopped my heart. I was going to live, but they couldn't see me. I was a dark shape against a dark piece of wreckage. They were flying toward the other hole, the main crash site a few hundred yards away where the rest of the plane had vanished. They were looking for the main event. They would miss me. "No!" I screamed, but my voice was a frozen croak. "No, I'm here! I'm here!" I had to signal. I had nothing. No fire, no flares. My wallet. I tore it from my frozen pocket. My credit card. It was plastic, but it was reflective. The sun wasn't out, but the sky was bright. I held it up, angling the small silver hologram toward the helicopter, waving my arm, a frantic, spastic motion. I was a broken puppet, begging for my life. The helicopter passed over the main crash site, hovering, and I thought they had missed me. My heart sank. They would circle, see nothing, and leave. But then, it banked. It turned, slow and majestic, and came directly toward me. It had seen me. The machine grew in the sky until it was a deafening, roaring god blotting out the sky. The downwash from the rotors was a 100-mile-an-hour blizzard, blasting me with snow and ice, stinging my face. The helicopter didn't land. It couldn't. The ice was too unstable. It hovered 20 feet above my head, a miracle of noise and power. The side door was open, and a man, in a bright orange suit, was kneeling at the edge. He pointed at me, then gave me a thumbs up. A second man, a rescuer, was clipped onto a hoist cable. He dropped from the belly of the aircraft, descending into the chaos. He landed on the ice next to me with a thud, his movements fast and precise. He unhooked himself and ran to me, crouching. "Sir, are you the only one?" he yelled over the rotor wash. I could barely form words. My jaw was locked. "Yes," I choked out. The rest are in, the water. They're gone." He didn't waste a second. "Okay. My name is Ben. We're getting you out. You're in severe hypothermia." He saw my leg. "Can you stand?" "No," I whispered. "My knee." "Got it." He was already working, pulling a horse collar, a bright yellow rescue sling, from his vest. He looped it under my arms, across my chest, clipping me in. His hands were warm. "Sure. This is going to be fast. It'll hurt. Ready?" I nodded. I was ready. He clipped himself onto my sling, then gave the yow signal to the hoist operator above. The cable went taut. I was lifted from the wreckage, my useless leg dangling. The pain was a white-hot nova, a blinding flash of agony as my full weight hung from my broken knee. But I didn't care. I was airborne. I was rising, spinning slowly under the helicopter. I looked down. I saw the fractured, lonely piece of ice. I saw the dark gash of the tail fin. I saw the black, freezing water of the lake that had tried so hard to claim me. And then it was all gone as I was pulled up, into the light and the noise. Hands grabbed me, pulling me into the warm, vibrating cabin. A thick wool blanket was thrown over me. The side door slid shut, and the roar of the wind was gone, replaced by the beautiful, deafening, life-saving scream of the turbine. The flight in the helicopter was a blur of noise and pain. The moment the cabin door shut, the world dissolved. The roar of the rotors was a physical weight, vibrating through the wool blanket they had wrapped around me. But the most overwhelming sensation was the warmth. The heater in the cabin was on full blast, and the hot, dry air felt like acid on my frozen skin. It was an agonizing, burning thaw that started in my lungs and spread to my face and hands. A medic was talking to me, his face close to mine, but I couldn't understand his words. The sound was just noise. My body, which had been fighting for 6 hours to stay alive, finally understood that the fight was over. It gave up. I fell into a blackness just as deep as the one in the plane, but this time it was a relief. I woke up to beeping, a steady, rhythmic, polite beep. It was the sound of a heart monitor. It was the sound of order, of rules, of physics working correctly. My first sensation was not cold, but a dull, heavy heat. I was buried in blankets in a hospital bed. The light in the room was a soft, artificial yellow, but to my eyes it was as bright as a star. I blinked, and the room swam into focus. An IV was taped to my right arm. My left leg was not a leg anymore. It was a massive white plaster cast, elevated on a pillow. The pain was still there, but it was distant, muffled by a cloud of painkillers. I was alive. I was warm. I was safe. A doctor came in. He was a kind-looking man with a gray beard. He told me I was in a hospital in Yellowknife. He told me how lucky I was. He used words like severe hypothermia and critical frostbite. He said my core temperature had been 82 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 Celsius, when they brought me in. I was in the moderate to severe stage, the one just before cardiac arrest. He told me the skin on my feet and my left hand was badly damaged, and they were fighting to save all my toes. And then he told me about my knee. The tibial plateau was fractured. The impact, or my escape, had shattered the top of my shin bone. It would require multiple surgeries. The first few days were just about the physical. The pain of thawing out was a new kind of hell. It was an electrical burning itch, a fire under the skin of my feet and hands that felt like being stung by a million hornets at once. I had nightmares, not of the crash, but of the feeling. I would wake up thrashing, tangled in the sheets, convinced I was back in the water, drowning in the dark. The nurses were patient, but I could see the look in their eyes. They were treating a man who had seen a ghost. Then came the questions, not from doctors, but from men in suits. Investigators, from the Canadian TSB. They were polite, somber. They sat by my bed with a voice recorder. They needed to know what happened. I was, as one of them put it, the human black box. I was the only witness. I told them everything. I told them about the electrical whine. I told them about the lights dying, the total failure. I told them about the 2 minutes of falling in the dark. I told them about the impact, the sliding, the sound of the ice breaking. And I told them about the water. I told them about the screams in the dark, the woman I couldn't find, the man I heard drown. Recounting it was like pulling a poisoned thread from my brain. I was an engineer. I gave them data, but every piece of data was attached to a memory of terror. Every time I closed my eyes, I wasn't in a safe, warm hospital. I was in the pitch-black cabin, feeling the ice water rise past my waist. I would jolt awake, gasping for air that wasn't there. I refused to let the nurses turn off the lights at night. I needed the light. I couldn't be in the dark, ever. The sound of the hospital's air conditioning, the quiet whoosh of the ventilation, sounded like the wind howling across the lake. My family arrived from Chicago, my wife, my parents. Their relief was a physical thing, a wave of emotion that I couldn't process. They cried, they held my good hand, but I felt distant. I was a different person from the man who had boarded that plane. He was a logical, calm engineer who believed in rules. I was, an animal who had clawed his way out of a hole, an animal who had made the choice to save himself and leave others to die in the dark. The media was calling it a miracle. The lone survivor of Flight 77, the miracle on the ice. They wanted a hero. They didn't understand. There was no miracle. There was just physics, and then a gap. And I had been the only one to fall through that gap and land on the other side. The guilt was the heaviest thing. It was worse than the broken leg, worse than the frostbite. 212 people were on that flight. I was the only one who walked out, or crawled out. Why? Because I was in the tail section? Because it broke off? Because I happened to wake up? Because I was strong enough to break my own knee to get free? My engineer's brain searched for a variable, a logical reason. There wasn't one. It was chaos. It was luck, and surviving luck is the heaviest burden you can carry. I had heard the last moments of those people. I carried their fear with me. I was alive, and they were gone, and I had no idea what to do with that. I spent 6 weeks in that Canadian hospital before they could safely transport me back to Chicago, and then came months of physical therapy. I had to learn to walk on my rebuilt knee. The frostbite had cost me the tips of 2 toes on my left foot, a constant numb reminder. The doctors and therapists were incredible. They were all focused on the recovery. They wanted to get me back to normal, but I knew, from the first night I spent in my own bed, that normal was gone forever. Normal was a concept from my old life, a life that had ended at 35,000 feet. I can walk now. I have a slight limp, a mechanical hitch in my step that my engineer's brain finds morbidly fascinating. My hands are scarred from the ice and the metal, but those are just the visible parts. The real trauma is the invisible kind. I can't be in a room if the door is closed. I can't sleep unless a light is on in the hallway. My wife bought the thickest blackout curtains you can buy, not to keep the light out, but to convince my brain that the sun is off, not that the power is dead. Any sudden darkness, a power flicker, a blown light bulb, and I'm not in my living room anymore. I'm back in the cabin, in the black, feeling the water at my waist. And the cold. I used to love the cold. My job was built around it. Now I can't stand an air conditioner. A cold drink makes my teeth ache with a kind of memory. The Chicago winter, which I used to embrace, is now my enemy. I live my life in a constant state of seeking warmth. People, the media, they called me a miracle. They wanted a story about the strength of the human spirit, about a man who wouldn't give up. I've been asked to write books, to give motivational speeches. I've turned them all down, because what I learned in that lake wasn't about the strength of the human spirit. It was about the terrifying, random, absolute indifference of physics. My survival wasn't a miracle. It was an equation. I was in the tail section. The tail section broke off. It landed on a piece of ice thick enough to hold it for 6 hours. The ELT's battery, separate from the main system, worked. A search and rescue team was close enough to find me before I froze. Change any one of those variables, and I'm just a name on a memorial plaque. I'm not a hero. I'm just the remainder of a very brutal calculation. I left my job as a geothermal engineer. I couldn't fly anymore. I couldn't be in those remote, cold places. I teach physics now at a community college. I try to explain the rules of the world: stress, load, thermal dynamics, electricity. I find comfort in the rules, but I know the truth. I know that sometimes, for no reason at all the rules can break at once. The lights go out, and you're left falling in the dark. You don't get over something like this. You don't move on. You just carry it. It's a new part of your anatomy. I survived. But the me that boarded that plane in Anchorage, the calm, logical man who trusted the world, he didn't. He's still back there, in the dark, in the water. I'm just what crawled out. I'm the one who gets to see the sun come up. I'm the one who gets to feel the warmth, and I will never, ever take that light for granted. If you want to hear more unbelievable stories of survival and the people who live to tell them, subscribe.